Hello and welcome to Pour la Victoire. I'm Gabriella and today I'm so excited to share with you my review of McCalls 7974. This has been an extremely popular pattern in the sewing community since it came out in 2021. When I made it recently, there were a few things I noticed in relation to sizing, fabric types, and techniques, and I wanted to share with you how I approach this pattern for the best outcome in my opinion, so that hopefully it can be helpful to you if you're working on this pattern as well. So getting into it, McCalls 7974 includes a few different views. Let's start with the sleeve variation. So the most notable feature of this pattern, in my opinion, is the sleeve from view A. So view A features a little bit of a cutout at the sleeve, and then there's a cuff going around the bottom of the sleeve that ends in a tie to close out the keyhole. Super cute feature that's not really seen in any other patterns, not your standard puff sleeve. There's also a bishop sleeve finish with a cuff and a double puffed sleeve, which I think is from the original dress that this pattern is based off of. And there's a sleeveless version as well. In terms of neckline variations, the pattern features a V neckline. One variation includes a collar, a little pointed collar. The other main feature of the dress, apart from the sleeves, is a beautiful midriff and the wonderful row of buttons that closes the dress at the center front. And this dress comes in 3 lengths, a knee length, a midi length, and a maxi length. So getting into the pattern review, the first thing I want to talk about is this pattern is rated as easy. This is where I really question the difficulty rating scale that McCalls or the Big Four or whatever the company conglomerate of patterns is called now. I really question their rating scale because there are so many techniques and so many pieces in this dress that I struggle to imagine that this would be considered easy for a beginner. I've been sewing for over 10 years and this dress took me over a month from start to finish, and there were a few moments that had me scratching my head or some techniques that were, I would say, a bit more intermediate. So one thing to consider is buttonholes, and this dress has a lot of them. I believe it's like 13 or 14. I put in a few more and I'll get to that later of why I put in a few extra buttonholes. But if you're a beginner who probably has an entry-level machine, it might not have a buttonhole feature or attachment, or you may not have sewn a buttonhole by hand before, and working on over a dozen buttonholes by hand for the first time, it would intimidate me. I'll just leave it at that. The other thing is there's just so many pieces involved in this pattern. I struggle to, at times, keep track of the different tissue paper pieces and the cutout pieces and keeping everything labeled. It was just a lot to keep track of, a lot of little pieces. And I remember when I was first learning how to sew, things that had this many pieces just felt really overwhelming. I didn't have a big space at the time. I was literally sewing on top of a CD cabinet. There was no other surface for me to put my sewing machine, so this was a little bit of a struggle. I felt like working on this dress, it had so many different techniques. There were gathers, facings, lining, understitching, sleeves, the buttonholes, elastic. There was so much going on for the different views that it just seemed overwhelming to me as a seasoned sewist. Another thing that might trip up beginners is that this pattern has a lot of seams but doesn't provide explicit instructions for finishing each seam. For instance, there are a lot of panels in the skirt, but it just tells you to sew the seams, press, and move on. And that would be a lot of exposed fabric if you were to keep it that way. I chose to French seam my skirt seams, my sleeve seams as well, and I had to then change my order of operations in order to make the French seams, but I'm glad that I did because it means that my dress will last a little bit longer because all those raw edges are enclosed. And I also use serging on some areas, for instance around the armhole, in order to keep that fabric from fraying as I wore the dress. I would rate this pattern as intermediate or advanced beginner rather than easy. Another interesting thing of this pattern is that it says on the cover it has simple instructions. If I'm tackling facings, linings, understitching, sleeves with a keyhole feature for the first time, I want a little bit more than simple instructions. And while I could figure out a few of these techniques on my own from the experience I banked up over the years, I think some of these features needed a little bit more than just simple instructions. More of a deep dive would have been necessary. So getting into my make, I chose to make view C with the sleeves of view A. I absolutely loved the keyhole feature of the sleeves. I made a size 6 even though my measurements put me closer to a size 10, but the pattern had a lot of ease, a few inches of ease on the bust and waist, so I sized down to a 6. Additionally, I felt that in my mock-up, the V-neck of the front of the dress was a little bit low for my preference. I wanted to make this dress so that I could wear it to the office, and I needed a little bit more coverage, so I increased the height of the V-neck. I added about like an inch or an inch and a half, and I added an extra button up there. So I resized the placement of my buttons so that I could get that coverage, and I think this alteration worked out perfectly. I made my dress out of a floral print cotton lawn from Sevenberry. I bought this from Fabric Mart Fabrics a year ago, and it was just a delightful fabric to work with. I think this dress is really well suited to lightweight, drapey, flowy fabrics. It's recommended for cotton blends, crepe, lawn, and charmeuse. I feel like it would be a little challenging in charmeuse, but definitely like a crepe lawn. I'd say it would also be great for a lightweight linen. Any kind of lightweight, flowy fabric would be well suited to this dress. Now, one thing to add on that, I was making it in this cotton lawn fabric that was really lightweight and airy. However, it had a white ground, and I found that the fabric was a little bit sheer on its own. The fabric in the bodice was a little too sheer, and even the fabric in the skirt, I could see the outline of my legs. Whether this is due to the qualities of the fabric or maybe just that there's not a lot of fullness in the skirt, I'm not sure, so I actually chose to fully line my dress. So to line this dress, I had already cut out the front-facing pieces, so I had to reverse engineer the lining a little bit, but it was a pretty easy thing to do. So I chose to line the front of the bodice and the entire skirt. I used a lightweight white cotton lawn, I believe it was, that was just in my stash left over from another project, which was amazing, so I got to use up some scraps. And because I already had the facings, the front facings of the bodice already cut out, I had to reverse engineer the front bodice lining a little bit. I cut out the front bodice lining pieces in the white cotton lawn with a little bit subtracted from the front of the pieces to account for the facing. I stitched the lining pieces to the front facings, then attached that to the neckline edge of the dress, and then finished off the neckline in the back with the yoke. And I believe I just hand stitched the yoke to the back of the dress instead of using the burrito method, just because at this point I was a little bit strayed from the instructions and the normal order of operations, but it was possible, a rather minimal amount of hand stitching. Then I cut out skirt panels out of the white cotton lawn. I subtracted a little bit from the front of the center front panels to account for the outer skirt folding in to create a facing at the center front. And then to put the dress together with this kind of half lining method, I gathered the skirt, I gathered the lining, and I gathered the skirt individually and then basted them together. Then I attached the skirt to the bodice, leaving the bodice lining piece separate. And then I ironed in the seam allowances for the bodice lining piece and sewed the bodice lining down by hand. And that way I was able to cover the raw edges where the skirt met the bodice front. And then for the back of the bodice where it met the skirt, I just had that edge serged, so it shouldn't ravel and it wasn't a big deal. I didn't feel like it was necessary to line the back of the bodice because it is meant to be a form-fitting summer dress. I didn't want to have too much fabric around me. So then moving on to the sleeves, when I was looking at reviews of this dress before I started sewing it, there was a lot of feedback on the construction process for this keyhole sleeve feature. The pattern has you finish off that keyhole edge with bias binding, which normally should work if the bias binding is very narrow and flexible, and if all the curved edges are clipped appropriately. However, the instructions didn't really mention this, which is interesting considering that they were simple instructions for a beginner. And a lot of people online said in their reviews that using the bias binding method left a little bit of like the fabric sticking out. It wasn't perfectly flush because of these extreme curved edges. It was such a small curved edge that they couldn't really get the fabric to lay flat. So I thought back to all the times I was trying to finish off a V neckline or a really curved neckline, and I always finish those with facings. So I applied that technique to the keyhole sleeve opening instead of using bias binding to finish the edge. I drafted a little facing. I interfaced the facing pieces and I serged along the outer edge of them just to keep them from fraying. And then I sewed the facing right sides together over the keyhole. I pinked the edge of the keyhole. I find that pinking instead of clipping in these scenarios just leads to a smoother finish because the pinking kind of accomplishes more clipping than I could do so neatly. So I pinked the seam allowance and then I flipped the facing to the inside, top stitched it down, and I have a flawless flat keyhole finish, super neat and clean, very easy to do, and I think it took even less time than trying to wrangle with bias binding. So keep that in mind if you're working on this dress and you want to make this keyhole sleeve. Draft yourself a little facing instead of trying to bind this really tight, narrow hairpin curve. Another interesting thing about this pattern is the illustrations shows the ends of the sleeve ties are square when in reality the pattern pieces lead to a curved or pointed tie end on the sleeves. This is great because I think the pointed tie ends just look a little more delicate and dainty and suit the overall vibe I was going for with this dress. But just something to keep in mind if you're expecting them to be square ties, they are not, they are pointed ties. And lastly, while this dress has a lot of panels in the skirt, there's actually not a lot of fullness in the skirt. They're pretty narrow panels, so that's something to keep in mind. If you want a little bit more fullness, you can expand the panels. Another alteration I made was to shorten the back bodice and midriff by about 1/2 inch. I'm pretty petite and I have a short torso, so I didn't want the midriff hitting at the wrong spot on me. However, once the dress was constructed, I feel like I probably didn't need to take out that 1/2 inch. What I did realize when the dress was finished is that there's actually not a lot of seam for the bust. I feel like this dress is drafted for an A-B cup maximum. I'm pretty small chested and I feel like that seam of the midriff and the underbust is kind of encroaching upon my bust. I'm not sure if that's the intended design, but I find that these styles of dresses look better when that seam is fully below the bust. So if you're a B cup and above, I would consider doing a full bust adjustment to add a little bit of room at the cup so that you get that seam perfectly placed. I also pinched out about 1/4 inch at the neckline so that I can snug up that neckline a little bit closer to me. Again, I'm intending to wear this dress to work, so I couldn't risk any wardrobe malfunctions. I love that this dress has pockets. It's also super easy to wear and put on. I don't unbutton it all the way, I just unbutton it down to my hips and then I step into it. It's super duper comfy. I wore it on really warm days, on kind of balmy fall days, and layered it up, and I just feel so comfortable in this dress. The style of the dress gives a bit of a vintage aesthetic without feeling like a costume. All in all, I would recommend this pattern with the caveat that you might need to pay extra attention to the fitting and finishing. Plan for a lining if your fabric is a little bit sheer and it's pretty easy to incorporate. And draft a facing instead of using bias binding around the keyhole sleeve. Let me know in the comments below if you've made this dress or if you've been thinking about making it. I had such a fun time making it, even though it took about a month. It was a bit of a brain teaser throughout the process, but I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I used every last scrap of fabric, which also felt really good. I can't wait to wear this dress for years to come. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about my approach to this design. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in my next video.